Okay, great.
Thank you, Jen. Hello and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us at today's FIT Author Talks. We're here with Alexandra Schwartz, and she will be talking about her fascinating book, Garmenting, Costume as Contemporary Art. The FIT Author Talks is part of the Love Your Library events series, an initiative by the FIT Library that brings authors from our community to speak about their work. And these talks encompass a multitude of creative mediums, themes, and celebrate the diversity of our FIT community. Alexandra has been teaching at the FIT Art Market Graduate Program since 2018. And this book was curated in conjunction with an exhibition at the Museum of Arts and Design in New York that was shown from March through August in 2020. And I'll just read a brief description from the MADS website about the show and Alexandra's book. The first global survey exhibition dedicated to the use of clothing as a medium of visual art, Garmenting, Costume as Contemporary Art, examines work by 35 international contemporary artists, from established names to emerging voices, several of whom will be exhibiting for the first time in the United States. By making or altering clothing for expressive purposes, these artists create garments, sculpture, installation, and performance art that transforms dress into a critical tool. Adopted globally as an artistic strategy, garmenting uses the language of fashion to challenge traditional divisions of form and function, cast a critical eye on the construction of gender, advance political activism, and address cultural differences. Thank you for joining us today and welcome.
Thank you so much, Eileen, for that introduction, and thank you to everyone at the FIT Library for having me. I'm really pleased to be here. So as you mentioned, the book Garmenting Costume as Contemporary Art accompanied the exhibition at the Museum of Arts and Design on Columbus Circle, which closed about 2 months ago. It was open from March until August. And it was a good size exhibition. It was 2 floors of the museum, and it had been a long time coming together. And certainly I see the book as a standalone, in addition to being the exhibition catalog, and a lot of the ideas I was trying to explore, I was able to get into in more depth in the book. So I'm sad that the show is no longer open for you to be able to see. Hopefully some of you saw it when it was up. But a lot of what I really kind of wanted to say and develop is in the book. So we're looking at the cover of the catalog. Um, and I thought I'd start by just showing you a little bit of how my thinking on the ideas in the exhibition came together and what got me thinking along these particular lines. So the book and the exhibition both examine the phenomenon of visual artists using garments, borrowing from the world of fashion and dress to explore ideas through installation, sculpture, performance. And something that people ask me a lot is, are there fashion designers included in this? There are not. So I was interested in a very specific phenomenon. I come from the world of art history. I'm trained as an art historian. I've worked as a curator for many years. I teach art history and museum studies. So I'm very much coming at it from that world. I've always been a huge fan of fashion and I'm fascinated by it, but it's not my first area of research. So what really interested me is, why are visual artists finding the language of fashion so useful? how do art and design cross over, which of course is a big part of MAD's mission as well. And what can the fields learn from each other? What kind of exchanges can take place? And what does it mean for visual artists to be crossing over into fashion in the way that these artists do? So as you mentioned, Eileen, the show was about 35 international artists from all over the world, some of them at the beginning of their careers and never before having shown in the US, some very well known, like Louise Bourgeois, who we're seeing here. And I'm going to walk through a little bit how my thinking on this came together and what I was interested in exploring. So what you're looking at here is not in the book or the exhibition, but this is a book and installation by Louise Bourgeois. It's called Ode à l'oubli. And here you see it taken apart and the pieces installed on the wall at the Museum of Modern Art. And then you see the original in the case. So this was a book that she made toward the end of her life. And for those of you who know Bourgeois, you may know that her family was involved in the textile industry. They were tapestry makers. And she saved a lot of her old clothes and also old household linens throughout her life. And at the end of her life in the 90s and into the 2000s, she died in 2010, she was using those textiles a lot in her work. So she mostly made sculpture out of more traditional materials, but she began to actually take those textiles and cut them up and make them into sculptures, books, and other kinds of objects. So this is a detail of one of the pages of Ode à l'oubli. And you can see right here, that is her monogram. Her married name was also began with B. I always blank on it. But so it was Louise Bourgeois and then her married name. And it was a very kind of old-fashioned thing to have these embroidered table linens with a monogram. One assumes that these came out of her wedding trousseau. That was a convention to have those embroidered linens, you know, pillowcases, towels, embroidered with the bride's married initials. So she had used that in this book, and it's this very kind of personal mark. All these other little bits of patchwork were also from her own wardrobe and her own household linens. And it was really striking to me how she seemed to be looking back on her life and thinking about how clothing is embedded with our memories, with our personal experiences. And her work is always very kind of psychological and very much about her experiences as a woman and a mother and a spouse. And clothing seemed to really sort of encapsulate that for her. I worked at the Museum of Modern Art at the beginning of my career, and the installation shot I just showed was from a permanent collection show that I co-curated back in 2010. So I first started thinking about these things back then when I was working with Bourgeois' work in that show. Then a couple of years later, I curated the first solo museum show by the artist Saya Woolfolk. I had moved to the Montclair Art Museum where I was starting a contemporary art program. And Saya, who was in the MAD show as well, uses garments. You can see these kind of fantastical figures engaged in this sort of Afrofuturist fantasy ritual. And she makes all these garments partly out of found materials. These are those cloud pajamas that used to be so popular. And then these kind of sculptural headdresses and pieces that go around the neck. There's a video that captures a performance that the performers actually wore those costumes for the performance. And my conversations with her really got me thinking about this idea of artists who are using clothing, because her work literally is both used in installation on mannequins and it can also be used in performances. So that doubling of being both an object and something that could actually be worn was really, really interesting to me. And she actually first suggested the term garmenting. She didn't know if she had made it up or if she had heard it somewhere else, but she found it very useful. And when I thought of titling the show Garmenting, I asked her and she said that was fine. But this idea of garmenting, you could think of it as analogous to like scrapbooking, but using garments as a kind of medium or a tool was something that I was really interested in. Of course, probably the most famous artist to use garments as a medium is Nick Cave, and his retrospective is opening at the Guggenheim this weekend. This is an installation that was at the Cranbrook Museum in Michigan. But Cave has been known for a long time using garments, his sound suits, that both are worn in performance and are displayed on mannequins in art museums. So the more I started thinking about this idea, I started seeing it everywhere. I certainly was thinking a lot about Nick Cave. It goes back to Yayoi Kusama. These are some of her garmenting works, you could say, part of her accumulation series. There's a shirt, a suit, a coat, and this image here I really love. It shows her actually wearing some of these garments. So this had been happening for a while, and one thing that was very important to me was to trace the history of it and see where and when it developed. So I was doing a lot of other different things as I was developing these ideas. It would kind of go on the back burner and then come back. But when I had an opportunity to do research on it, I really seized it. And at one point, I was invited to edit the critics page of the Brooklyn Rail that some of you may be familiar with. And I decided to take the opportunity to have people whose work I was interested in write about this phenomenon of garmenting. So this is a spread that has articles by several different artists. I also had art historians write about the intersection of art and fashion at different historical moments. Valerie Steele wrote something. So it really allowed me to get a bunch of my peers together to help think about these issues. I also took a research trip to France through a grant. And since France has always been the capital of fashion, I was really interested in French artists and how they were thinking about these ideas. So on the left is Karina Biche. On the right is Raphael Barantini, both of whom ended up in the show, and I met through that research trip. So these are a few installation shots of the show. I'm just going to kind of walk you through them and then tell you a little bit more about how the exhibition was arranged. So one of the things that interested me most was how garments are both extremely personal. We choose what we wear. We see it as an expression of our personality. What you wear depends on where you live, your gender, what you do for a living. So on the one hand, it's a very individual decision, but on the other hand, it's dictated by our culture, kind of standards of what one is supposed to wear if one is a particular gender, or depending on your profession or how old you are. And some of that is kind of embedded in our culture. Some of that's dictated by the fashion industry, which of course is also influenced by our culture. But so I was really interested in that intersection and how garments both reflect individual personalities, but also they speak to broader histories and broader currents in our culture. So in order to organize that within the book and the exhibition, I broke it down into 5 interrelated themes. So what we're seeing here is the functionality section. So that's looking at that division between art and design, or something that is non-functional and sits in a gallery versus something that you can wear. So all of these artists are kind of in that category. That's Bourgeois you see in the middle, Vivian Sundaram, an Indian artist on the left, and Zenobia Bailey, an American artist on the right. This is the cultural difference section. So these artists are using garments to think through how cultures develop different traditions, how they relate to one another, how race, ethnicity, class are expressed through dress. And I think that's why partly garments are so useful to a lot of contemporary artists who are interested in those issues and in exploring them through their work, because all those traditions are embodied in garments. So in the foreground, this is Yinka Shonibara, who uses Dutch wax print um, fabric to create these 18th century garments and places them on mannequins. This is meant to be this ghostly figure. It kind of has a long story I won't get into, but it's a lot about colonialism and that coming together of European fashion with African textiles, which in fact, Dutch wax printing was introduced into Africa by the Dutch colonists. And then this is by Mary Sabande, a South African artist who has a kind of alter ego who she dresses in different colors to signify this alter ego whose name is Sophie's progression, and it's kind of an allegory for apartheid in South Africa. So those were on the 5th floor. On the 4th floor, I had my gender section. These two are by Esma Muhammad. It's called One of the Boys. So these are on the top, basketball jerseys, and on the bottom, ball gown skirts, hoop skirts. So she's looking at gender because these originally were worn in a performance, one by a woman, one by a man. And then, of course, they're masculine on top, basketball being generally associated as this kind of men's sport, even though there is women's basketball. And then this very hyper feminine Disney skirt on the bottom. And she was interested in thinking about how basketball for many young boys, especially, is seen as this kind of ticket to a more secure life and to fame and fortune. But of course, that's a fantasy in most cases. It's a fairy tale. Those are Mark Newport, Zoe Buckman, all of whom are looking at gender in one way or another. Sile Woolfolk. And then this section was called Activism, and it's artists who are using garments specifically to advance political ideas. So this is Jeffrey Gibson. This is a Thai artist named Jakai Sirabut. And this is Hunter Reynolds. This was a dress that Hunter Reynolds wore in a cage in a gallery show in 1990. And it has aspects of course, cross-dressing and thinking about transsexuality, but he said that it came about because he realized that as kind of progressive as the New York art world likes to think it is, he found he could not have conversations about gender or about masculinity or about trans people within the art world. But he found that if he put himself in drag, but in a cage in a gallery, the kind of cage that you might see at a nightclub, people were willing to engage with him. So it's a kind of painful story, but a very interesting one, especially given that particular moment and being in the middle of the AIDS crisis. Sadly, Hunter Reynolds died during the run of the show, but he was able to see it beforehand, which was really lovely. He came to the opening. And then finally, performance was a really important part of the exhibition. Something I felt really strongly about is that many of these works are meant to be worn. You know, they may be works of art, but they actually can be worn on the body. And so I wanted to make sure that we included performance as a part of the exhibition itself. A lot of museum shows these days have a performance series kind of as a supplementary program, but I wanted performance to be right there in the gallery and to have the chance to see these works of art in motion and kind of see all aspects of them. So there was a section of the gallery where videos by all the performance artists were screened all the time. This also shows footage of some of the other work in the show, the Hunter Reynolds piece, a piece by Kent Monkman that he did for the Met Museum, and a Jeffrey Gibson performance of the New Museum. But we also had a performance series in the gallery mostly. There was one per month, and that was really, really exciting. This is the first in the series by the artist Lexi Hotai. So this is a performer wearing this incredible monster costume. This was by Young Yu. So this is a performance with 4 different dancers wearing these costumes that took place in the gallery. And this snapshot really allows you to see what this was like. And this is a performance by a Hong Kong artist, Enoch Chang, that was also in the gallery. This final one was in the Mad Theater. It was by Jamil Olawale Kosoko. But as you can see, that's Jamil there with this incredibly beautiful kind of lavish costume that he performed in. So as you can tell, there were a lot of different themes I wanted to explore in the show. And the book really allowed me to do that most fully. And my hope is that it will stand as a resource on this idea of the intersection of art and costume. There actually has never been a kind of scholarly book written on this exact subject before. So something that was really interesting for me is that I got to do a ton of reading in fashion theory and fashion history and really try to forge this new discourse on this intersection of art and costume. So I wrote something called A Brief History of Garmenting. There was an abbreviated, very abbreviated version of this in the exhibition. But in it, I tried to trace this overlap between visual art and dress and costume fashion and how it's changed over time, where it originated. And I found the most useful place to start was the 17th century, where I discovered that both at Louis XIV's court at Versailles and in the Qing dynasty court in Beijing, dress was codified in this incredibly elaborate way. And there were a lot of rules for what courtiers could wear that showed their rank and showed their deference to the leader. But also, it was part of this much broader visual arts program in both cases. And that was kind of what really made me like pin the beginnings of garmenting to the 17th century, that both the Qing dynasty and the court of Louis XIV were really trying to create a kind of entire visual program that fashion was a huge part of. And it was tied to economics, it was tied to class and status, and that all seemed very fruitful to me. I then trace it through the early 20th century with artists like Stepanova and Popova, the Russian constructivists in the teens and 20s. Sonia Delaunay, I always thought of as kind of the like fairy godmother of garmenting, because her practice combined painting and these garments and housewares and even a car that were also very tied to what she was doing in her more traditional visual art. But this moment in the 50s and 60s was really interesting to me, with the work of 3 Japanese women artists, 2 of whom were based in New York for part of the time. But Atsuko Tanaka, Yoko Ono, and Yayoi Kusama, who I mentioned before, were all really thinking about this intersection of art and dress. And I thought it was interesting that they were all doing it at the same time. They were all using their own bodies. So Tanaka's electric dress, she actually would perform in. This is Yoko Ono's famous cut piece. And then I talked about Kusama before. But it was very interesting to me, both that there's so many women artists who use garmenting, and also that because clothing is a language that helps express racial identity, national identity, ethnic identity, artists who were expatriates seem to also gravitate toward it a lot because they seem to be thinking about these ideas of identity and expressing them through their work. I then go through the themes in the show with entries on each of the works. This gives you a little sense of the design of the book. This was a wonderful piece by a native artist, Inuit artist, that combined aspects of Tinglet, which is her tribe ritual, and this is a 1940s Vogue pattern, a really gorgeous work that I didn't know before I was researching the show. I actually found it through a Google search. And she ended up just being an incredible person to work with, and the work was just gorgeous. Kenneth Saitlin. Gender, Sia Woolfolk's work, activism. This is this incredible work by Chakai Sarabut, a Thai artist, that's based on Thai military uniforms that he has embellished with amulets. So these are all Buddhist figures of the Buddha, these amulets that he's embroidered onto this vest. And this is actually him wearing them. But he's referring to the Thai Civil War, basically, which was a war based on religion, and the tradition of Thai soldiers sewing amulets into their uniforms as talismans against harm. The work is called Blind Faith, and it's kind of a critique of the government and, you know, the practice of sending people into war on blind faith. Performance. I also invited several scholars to contribute to the book. This addresses performance and garmenting, and it's by one of my colleagues at MAD, Lydia Bronner, who's a performance scholar and also the director of education. Another essay called The Sartorial Uncanny by Rhonda Gorelick, who I'm guessing many of you have read. She was formerly the dean of the art and design school, the art history division at Parsons. She's now at SMU. And she wrote on this idea that costume exhibitions, and also this particular exhibition, are really kind of uncanny and unnerving because you see all these bodies that aren't actual bodies. It's like you see the costume, but there's no body in them. And there's something very unnerving about that. Karen Owen is a scholar based in Singapore, and she had previously done a lot of work on kimonos and other crossovers between art and design. And she wrote a really fascinating essay highlighting a lot of East Asian artists. And then Jonathan Michael Square, whose work many of you may know. He has a big digital presence with his Fashioning the Self project. He also teaches at Parsons now, and he wrote about specifically Yinka Shonibara and Mary Sabande. So that kind of walks you through a lot of the main themes in the book. I'd certainly be happy to answer any questions you might have, and thank you so much.
If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and I could read them out. I have a question, if it's okay to start
Sure.
with. You capture the importance of empowering dress as a fundamental aspect of the ego, and just kind of nourishing the self-esteem, but also as a tool of really speaking out and bringing awareness, exploring gender, oppression, servitude, and body constrictions, body ownership, gender, traumas of war, racism. It covers so much: poverty, drugs, violence. But there's also that fun side. You know, it's interesting to see the sense of humor that comes out in some of these pieces also that you showcase.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if you're noticing any societal differences these days towards acceptance and like a resignation of the people at being more accepting to these ideas. Um,
Yeah, toward the ideas
I
of
think of just really speaking out and also just
yeah,
the um, the idea of dressing as a form of advocacy and awareness. Do you think it's
yeah,
more
absolutely.
like people are more open to it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think just in terms of norms of dress, things are much more open than they used to be in terms of gender expression, gender fluidity, kind of pondering the whole idea of what's appropriate, quote unquote, to wear depending on one's gender or one's job or where you live in the world. So I feel that that has opened up a lot. One thing that was so interesting to me is that I think there was a concern among a lot of the artists all over the world that a lot of indigenous traditions and, kind of historical traditions are being lost these days because of globalization, fast fashion. Like it used to be when you traveled to another country, people really looked different in what they wore, and now that's not really true. So something that I found really interesting is that a lot of artists were using um calling on indigenous traditions, indigenous fabrics, um, silhouettes, what have you, symbolism, to think about those traditions and think about those histories. And sometimes it was kind of an effort to preserve some of them. Sometimes it was a critique of them. Sometimes it was kind of positioning those histories and traditions within a broader transnational conversation. But I do feel as if the whole idea of dress is really kind of symbolic and relevant right now. Of course, I also started working on this well before the pandemic, and then it was delayed because of the pandemic. And for a while, no one was really thinking about dress much at all because we were all wearing sweatpants all the time and in lockdown. So it was an interesting time to be thinking about that. And then played a big role in the Black Lives Matter protests. I actually use an illustration of some of the protests in my essay. So it was because it was such a time of crisis, it was kind of very interesting to see how that affected ideas about dress as they were being discussed in the media too.
All right, thank you. I'm going to take a question from Camille in the chat, and she's wondering, how did you find the artist? And many are well known, but maybe how did you find the less well known artists as well?
Yeah, it was a huge variety of different ways. The well-known artists were not difficult to think about. I mean, I knew Nick Cave had to be in it. I knew Yinka Shonobara had to be in it. I actually originally had been hoping we could borrow works by Kusama and let's see, Lorraine O'Grady and some other kind of earlier artists, and it ended up being very complicated logistically. So I ended up making the show a little more contemporary than I had originally meant it to be, but that was fine. So the lesser known artists, it was a real variety. As I mentioned, I found Tana Seitlin through a Google search. Like I was just kind of Googling around for artists who use dress, and I found that dress. Originally, I didn't even know who the artist was because it was on a website for a group show that wasn't very well labeled. And it was like a small group show at a university gallery in the Midwest. But eventually I tracked her down. Some artists were recommended by other artists. Saya Wolfalk was really helpful. She's a close friend and interlocutor, and she pointed me in a lot of interesting directions. Young Yu, for example, was her student at Columbia. She's probably the youngest artist in the show. Um, let's see, who else is less known? A couple I found out about through my grant to go to Paris, Karina Biche and Raphael Barantini. Trying to think who else. Yeah, so I kind of kept a list on my phone for years of artists who I thought might be good for the show. And there were many who I could have included and would have liked to include, but, you know, because of the parameters and the logistics, I ended up going with the ones who really showed a diverse representation of different parts of the world, different ages, different media to some extent. So I kind of ended up narrowing it down that way.
Yeah, that's great. I love the diversity that you chose in images and the international scope. Was there a
It was very
particular,
important to me.
yeah, um, was there a particular artist you really enjoyed working with or and that you found like really surprising or enlightening or inspirational?
I mean, all of them were great to work with. One artist who I did not know before and who was recommended to me by a curator friend based in Hong Kong is Shilasa Rabanjari, who did a work called My Great Great Grandmother's Shawl that deals with both the tradition of shawls in Nepalese culture, but also the global garment industry. She, I hadn't met before. She had never shown in the US before, and she was just delightful, and I was really glad to get to know her. Jakai Sirabut, who's based in Thailand. Also, I had known his work for a while. He used to have a gallery in the US and he went to art school here. But he was wonderful. He actually spoke to my students at different times. Like he was really, really lovely. But really, everyone was great. Everyone was happy to be in the show and very cooperative, and it was a wonderful experience.
Great. I really liked Jacques Sarabut's, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, his piece. It really stood
Yeah.
out to me.
Yeah.
And I found it fascinating that bullets were also
Hmm.
woven into that textile. It's
Yeah,
such a
it was
stunning,
incredible. Those were very heavy. Um,
it looked heavy, but
yeah, it was
also so
really
cool.
heavy. In fact,
So
one of the dress forms we had to tether to the wall or else it would have fallen over. So like there are always these like surprises when you're installing. But those works had actually been lost. I had found those online and it has a double date. So Jakai incredibly generously offered to remake them. So
wow,
he entirely remade them for the show. And he said he had always dreamed of being in a show at MAD and he really wanted to do it. So it was just really lovely.
amazing. Gloria would like to know, how long did it take you to write the book as a whole? I know you said that you really did start thinking about this like 10 years ago.
Yeah. Um, I wrote the whole book before the pandemic. So I remember finishing it like in early March 2020 and then just like abandoned it for a long time. It probably took me about 6 months or so to do the actual writing, but most of it toward the end, like most of it over maybe 2 months. And I think I gave the authors about 6 months to write their essays. But the my main essay certainly was a lot of research and a lot of kind of processing fashion theory and history, which I hadn't really worked with before. So it was really intellectually, it was really fun. It was like really something new for me, and I felt like I was creating something different. And the FIT library was invaluable. in
Thank
my
you.
sources.
Thank you. And yes, your book is very different, and it's a very unique, special point of view. I'm enjoying it so much. I keep
Thank
going
you.
back to it because I keep discovering different things and layers in it.
Oh, that's so lovely. Thank you.
Yvette was wondering if there's a particular garment that really inspired you in this process.
Um, I mean, Louise Bourgeois was always in my mind. Um, I'd say that probably Saya Woolfolk's work most inspired me because I have such a long working relationship with her, and her work really got me thinking about a lot of these ideas. So, getting to know her process and how she decided to start working with garments. She actually took construction classes at FIT when she was right out of art school. She went to art school at the Art Institute of Chicago, but she took some classes at FIT, and it was really interesting, and I feel kind of my window into this whole endeavor, to get to know her work and her process.
G is wondering if you think you will do more work with dress and fashion.
I would love to. I don't have any immediate plans to, but teaching in the graduate school, I get to walk past the fashion conservation labs all the time, and it's just so interesting. I love it. I mean, I'm not a fashion scholar, like I'm the first to say that. So I don't know exactly what direction I would go with that. But certainly I'm fascinated by the topic. I mean, one thing I would really like to do is something on more historical artists. Like I'd love to do something with Sonia Delaunay and with the Russian artists, or even I think those three Japanese artists I mentioned would be a great show. Um, Tanaka, Ono, and Kusama. So, maybe it could take the form of a book, maybe it could be a show, but like I'd like to really be able to delve into the more historical aspect at some time.
Thank you. Um, I think Matthew asked a question, but I'm sorry, Matthew, I don't see it here. Do you mind retyping it? I was also wondering, do you find that you notice in regards to street style a crossing over in context of individual expressionistic artistic style? And do you notice any patterns or similarities in regards to conceptual designs versus street style?
Well, what comes to mind immediately is one of the artists in the show, Enoch Chang, had clothing for himself made in association with the show. He's based in Hong Kong, but he was in New York on a fellowship at the Natural History Museum, which is a whole other area of his work. Um, so he was here when the pandemic hit, and he took these photographs of New York City sidewalks covered in masks and um, like kind of the detritus of the pandemic. And then, of course, like New York sidewalks, you always see that like disgusting old gum and stuff like that. So he took photographs of them and he had a fabric made of it. And he has these clothes made with this fabric that he wears all the time. Like I had lunch with him on Tuesday and he was wearing the pants, and like he spoke to my FIT class a few weeks ago and he was wearing some of it. So that was a very kind of direct way that happened. Um, in general, most of the clothing in the show is so far out that I don't really see a lot that, reminds me of it in day-to-day life. Most of it is really not meant to be worn except in performance. But I do see those overlaps, and certainly in the sort of conceptual thinking about what clothing does. It's really interesting to talk to to students and to colleagues who, are much more knowledgeable about fashion than I am, about that.
Oh, that's so cool. What an interesting combination. I didn't
Yeah.
even think of it on that level. That's great.
Yeah.
Matthew asked, in respect to performance, how does costuming of Broadway shows and movies influence what people consider as garmenting? How did Hollywood
Interesting.
influence what might be seen in museums? How did a show like Kinky Boots bring footwear to the public art
Mm.
room?
Well, I think that, I mean, I'll speak to kind of my work with these artists. I think that the sort of theatrical sensibility is really important to a lot of these artists, and the fact that um most of these are not things you'd wear on the street if they're wearable at all. They really are meant for performance, and they have that kind of over the top, um colorful, extravagant sense to them. So in that sense, I do see that overlap definitely. And also, it makes me think of the current show at Mad, which was curated by my colleague Elisa Author, of Machine Dazzle, which is taking his costumes, a lot of his costume work with Taylor Mack and others, and installing them in the galleries, and kind of appreciating their craftsmanship, and that they are works of art. So certainly I see Machine's work as being related to a lot of work in my exhibition, and I feel as if all those aspects are really interconnected.
Got it. Yeah. Elizabeth is wondering which fashion theorists seem most relevant to this project.
Oh gosh, it's been a while since I read them. So I'm trying to remember. I have my books here though, so I can tell you some that were helpful to me. Let's see. Well, I read a fair amount of Anne Hollander. I read some of Valerie's writing. Um, I mean, as I said, there isn't much written on this exact subject, but uh, this oh no, this is the Curating Fashion book. Like, a lot of the Bloomsbury anthologies were really helpful to me, just in like getting a basic grip on fashion theory. I thought Roland Barthes' theories were really interesting and helpful. Um, I thought a fair amount about like some more kind of sociological texts like Veblen. I went back to that. I found that interesting. Actually, I thought a fair amount about Kant, and, that breakdown between fine and decorative art that he really like made the law for many, many centuries. I went back to him. Trying to think who else was really interesting. Um, yeah, I'm afraid I'm kind of blanking on some of them right
Well,
now.
like you said, you really had to do your own research and also come up with a lot of this theory yourself.
I did, yeah. I mean, I kind of read a lot of the fashion theory and then put it aside
Right,
because it was good as background for me, but it wasn't really what I was talking about exactly.
right.
Um, there's another book that, I mean, one thing I will say that I found really interesting, and I know that there are projects in the works that are going to change this, but it was very difficult to find global histories of fashion. It was all still very, very Eurocentric. And, I know there are some big projects coming up that are dealing with global histories of fashion. There's one book I found that I found very useful, that was written by a professor at Montclair State along with someone else, and I'll have to look for it on my shelf. But I was really I was really looking for kind of transnational global histories, and it was very surprising to me that there wasn't as much as I thought there would be.
I think you kind of answered this already, but Beth wondered if you see yourself in your writings adding to the theoretical framework. And it seems like yes. This is,
I hope so. Yeah,
yeah.
I really hope so. I mean, it was, I should say there have been a couple of exhibitions, one maybe 15 years ago and one maybe 25 years ago, that touched on some of these ideas of art in of fashion and art. Most of them also included like two-dimensional representations of dress. And certainly there's been more done on historical um portraiture and such, and how it captured fashion from different times. Um but in terms of theorizing how contemporary artists are using it, it's like there really wasn't anything until this. So I do feel very proud of that, and I hope that people use it as a resource.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's why I keep coming back to it because there's so many original, interesting parts of your book.
Thank you.
It really is fascinating. I love it.
Thank you so much.
Are you working on anything new you might want to share with us, or not quite yet?
Yeah, it's funny. I had three exhibitions that were pushed back because of the
Oh,
pandemic,
wow.
and one of them is still up. It's at the Aldrich Museum. It's called 52 Artists: A Feminist Milestone, that I co-curated with the Aldrich's chief curator. Um, and it's looking back at a Lucy Lepard show at the Aldrich from 1971. So I had that open in June, Garmenting opened in March, and then I did another exhibition last year in Oklahoma. So I had all these projects going at once, and then they all opened at once. So I'm kind of in the research stage right now. There are a couple of different projects that I'd like to pursue. One of which is the Sonia Delaunay project. She did costumes and stage sets in the late 60s, early 1970s, for a dance company that was part of Andre Malraux's program for like setting up cultural centers around France. So at some point, I'd really like to do that and maybe write a bigger history of the intersection of art and fashion that goes back more in time. So I'm thinking about that. There are a couple of exhibition projects I'm thinking about that are not really related to garmenting. So I'm sort of in the research and development phase, and also teaching and writing a lot.
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
In that regard, is there a favorite part of the process, like that you have in particular? Um,
Yeah, I love the research phase. I mean, I love being in libraries and really diving into the research. Like, I have very like particularly sharp memories of like the final parts of writing the garmenting catalog, um, and having been immersed in all that research and finally getting my ideas into words. That was just really, really exciting. And then I love installation in the museum, part of it, like seeing all the work together and working with the artists. That part is really thrilling as
really
well.
rewarding. Yeah, that's very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. So those are probably my two favorite parts. And then it's great to just get people's reaction and get to engage with people giving tours and, talks like this. So that's another favorite part too.
Wonderful. Beth has a further question for you, but I think I could connect you guys through email if that's okay, Alexandra, in
Sure.
regard to the author from Montclair State.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, great.
Thank you so much. Did anyone have any other final questions, or would you like to say anything to the group, Alexandra?
No, just thank you so much for joining the talk. It was really fun to get to talk about the book and the show, and thanks for your time.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for attending and for being part of Love Your Library's author talks. And thank you so much, Alexandra. We love your book, Garmenting, and
Thank you.
Thank you again. Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
Eileen, and thanks for your great questions.
Thank you so much.
Have a good night.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.